Welcome, everybody. I'm Dave Fortson, host of the Greenproofing series. Welcome back. Really excited to have today Jim Fitzpatrick, director of the Regenerative Fund for Nature at Conservation International. Did I say that
You
correctly,
got
Jim?
it. Yeah, nailed it.
Wonderful. Jim, tell me where you're calling in from today. I'd love to hear.
Yeah, calling in from Portland, Oregon on the semi-sunny West Coast today, which is nice in the wintertime.
Wonderful. Good. And for those of you who follow the Greenproofing series, I'm in a new office. I'm up in beautiful San Anselmo, California. I'm like looking out onto a beautiful forest of redwoods and pine. So that's a little new experience for me coming out of Santa Barbara, which is a little different landscape, but just a reminder of California. You go north to south, and what an amazing set of biomes all the way up to the beautiful Pacific Northwest. Go West Coast, always representing proper. So, Jim, let's just jump right into it. Super excited to have this call from Regen Network's perspective and what you're doing at Conservation International. We have a lot of overlap in this particular topic today around regenerative agriculture.
Mhm.
So, before we get into the details of that, I'd love to first hear about your personal journey, about how your career arc. You can go back as far as you want or as recent as you want, but how did you arrive at this position at Conservation International? Tell us a little bit about your professional history in to become a sustainability professional.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll share a little bit of a personal story too. I think it really started with my grandmother, honestly, and hiking around Mount Hood out here in Oregon with her. We'd identify plants. She'd tell Native American stories and we'd examine animal scat. And I just thought how cool my grandmother is sitting there looking at coyote and bear scat. And we're talking about what did those animals eat. And it was really, she instilled a love, I think, in me, and more importantly, an appreciation for the outdoors and the natural world. And I think also how fragile it is. And from there, it was clear to me I wanted to be a part of that natural world. And that's was always really the foundation for my career. And I've done everything in the sense of trail maintenance, trail clearing for the Forest Service. I knocked on doors for the Sierra Club, trying to sell Sierra
Nice.
Club memberships. What a just exhausting and challenging part-time job for 6 months while you're in your 20s. But it was a bit of a gradual transition after that. I decided, all right, after working for the Nature Conservancy and doing really exciting field work, I needed a full-time salary job. So I transitioned into the energy efficiency space when Energy Star and renewable
Yeah, sure.
energy and CFLs and LEDs were coming onto the market.
Yeah.
So did private consulting for a while there and got a little bit tired of the regulatory environment. And I heard somebody from Nike speak at a Green Sports Alliance conference. And for me, that was this light bulb moment. I could combine sports and sustainability into a career. And so that became my goal. Went to Nike, worked there for 9 years. And it was really there I was exposed to the leather supply chain and
Sure.
regenerative agriculture through Rebecca Burgess and Fibershed. And then that kind of became this watershed moment, that next watershed moment for me. And I feel very fortunate to have landed at Conservation International managing this fund, this regenerative fund for nature.
Wonderful. I love hearing that story. A couple things. I knocked doors, many thousands of doors in my 20s also. So
yeah,
I got a deep respect for anyone who's able to be told no,
yeah, you learn that quickly.
be told no 1,000 times. So
Yeah.
that one is just super cool. I love hearing about that. And also the intersection of sports and regenerative anything is, I think, a really neat area. For all of my listeners, they may not know, but I'm an avid pickleball player. Have
Okay.
not figured out how to tie in sustainability and pickleball yet, or chase around a little plastic ball across all kinds of various hardscapes. But anyhow, we'll pick up that
Yeah,
conversation
yeah,
later.
yeah. Well,
Yeah, yeah.
post podcast, we can get into that.
Yeah, exactly. If anyone's going to figure that out, I'm going to figure it out because I am a major addict on the pickleball front and always seeking to make all my worlds combined. Great. Hey, thanks for sharing. I'm excited to dig into this intersection of fashion and fiber and
Mhm.
regenerative agriculture, which seems to be like your sweet spot at the moment. I think this is a rich one, just I think a super rich territory, right? In the time of fast fashion, I think in the time of really trying to create the right relationship between land stewards on the ground
Mhm.
and corporate offices who are trying to meet their sustainability goals and trying to meet the demands of their consumers who are increasingly saying, is this thing I'm wearing good for me, the planet, and people generally? And trying to land that in an elaborate ability to design a program that works, design impact reporting that works, design the communication, and make sure it makes business sense, right? The business logic around it has got to work. And it's from that standpoint, Maybe can you just give us a little bit of a wide angle view of what it looks like for you today to like grapple with that at Conservation International? And frankly, why is CI in that space? It is a somewhat niche space. Conservation International obviously is a heavyweight on the global stage. But why did you all choose to zero in on this? Tell me about kind of the long tail impacts around this nexus between regenerative agriculture, fiber, and fashion.
Yeah, it's a great question. When I think Conservation International has projects in over 100 countries, and to your point, has been doing this since I think the mid 80s when Peter Seligman founded CI, and is really focused on working with these communities in commodity production systems. It's a reality that we can protect or we can go into these spaces, but the reality is a lot of our commodities come from these communities. And so, how do we work with those communities to create more resilience, better livelihoods for those people? We need to farm shrimp, we need to farm cotton and food, but there's a better way to do that. And so Conservation International has always worked on focusing on like, how do we work with nature versus against it? And there's really, I think, a gap, especially within the fiber space and fashion industry when it comes to raw material production. And we can dive into this in more detail, but a lot of fashion brands have no visibility to where their raw materials come from, right? Where does the leather come from? The cotton, the wool, the cashmere, the rubber, things like that. And so this is a great opportunity when you talk about traceability to start at the source and work down the supply chain and get brands to understand the impact that they're having, but also the opportunity that they can create to all of those things you mentioned around corporate targets and consumer expectations. And so we've decided to carve out that niche really in this fashion industry because Conservation International has that legacy of working with in commodity production systems, primarily in the global south, with a lot of these communities that manage some of the most biodiverse rich spots in the world, irrecoverable carbon, all these things that are important to reducing our anthropogenic impact on planet Earth.
Great. So help me land something then. So I guess the area I'm most keen about, at least to start with, to kick off the conversation, is there's a corporate goal, and the demand from consumers of saying, hey, brand X, I want the best fiber on my body as possible. I want to make sure that wherever that fiber is being produced in the world, that it is having the least amount of impact and maybe is actually creating a country to ecological and community uplift. So that's a big, difficult thing, particularly in complex global supply chains that are pretty much the hallmark of really any commodity or any product being made, it feels like, in the world that lands on our particular desks or on our particular backs. So what would you say is your primary role in connecting goal and objective coming from a corporate or where they think they want to be and developing the right relationship on the ground with, let's call it a community in the global south, an indigenous community or a small landholder, farmer? Where do you start and how do you build a high quality relationship between somebody on the ground producing and the corporation and the customer? Can you just give us a broad understanding of considerations of that?
Yeah, I'll do my best. I think there's a couple of different motivations for these corporates to start to care about where their fiber comes from, right? There's three main buckets, and you hit on a couple of them. Some of those might be around corporate targets, corporate commitments that they've either set without a strategy or that they're actually trying to be more mindful and conscious of understanding their impact as a corporate entity, right? There's policy, there's TNFD, there's EUDR, there's new policy that is coalescing regardless of how sharp the teeth are going to actually end up being. People are caring. Are you using forced labor to source your cotton? Do you know where your cotton comes from? Where's your leather coming from? People are starting to ask these questions. So that's forcing the hand as well. And then you mentioned the consumer, and the consumer that you described, I would say, is the minority typically, right? And a lot of consumers, their behaviors and their values don't match up, right? They say they care, but then the dopamine hit of continuously buying what feels good or looks good tends to typically be the trend and the motivation for the general or average consumer. But nonetheless, there's a different expectation and a shifting expectation with this new generation that's starting to come up and have a lot more spending power. So from a motivation perspective or pushing the corporate entity, those tend to be or are three of the primary drivers, in my opinion. And so it's, again, all right, then you start to understand, you start to work back your supply chain, and you got to understand how complex supply chains are for natural fibers and how when you start to talk about synthetics and plastic and fossil fuel based fibers, how there's just a gap there that is not even being explored or trying to be explored about where that oil or fossil fuel originated from and what is the
Sure.
impact of
Right.
that. As you start to work up the supply chain as a corporate entity, you start to work with your suppliers, and a cotton fiber may change hands a dozen times, right? From the farm to a
I
food.
didn't realize that. That's
Yeah,
amazing.
it goes through a lengthy process of brokers, intermediaries, the ginners, the spinners, the dye houses, the weaving, the cut and sew, and the finished goods manufacturing. And it's really only been in the last 15 years that a lot of these corporates have even known who their tier two suppliers are. So tier one is the person I cut a PO to and say, hey, I need 100 t-shirts, and they make 100 t-shirts.
And they have their own ecosystem after tier one, I assume.
It does. And tier four is what we call kind of raw material or on farm. So
Mm.
very few fashion brands know tier four. The larger ones, smaller ones, niche brands, of course, might have more visibility into that. But so that's essentially the challenge. And brands are like, I buy t-shirts, I don't buy cotton. And that's
Yeah,
the
right.
narrative we're trying to change. And there's actually tremendous value in these partnerships and investing in these commodity communities that can really benefit and create value for those corporates, in addition to nature and improving the livelihoods of those folks on the ground who are the farmers and the herders. And so
Mhm.
that's where we're trying to create a new relationship and understanding and a value proposition for a corporate to do that, because the Regenerative Fund for Nature was founded by Kieran and Inditex, two fashion brands that on the forefront of saying, hey, this is the right thing to do. We want to take this first step and make that investment. And now we're saying, okay, what is the value to get more brands to invest? And how can we create price stability for consumers and corporates? How can we help these corporates achieve targets through SBTI? How can we create these little research opportunities for new commodities and new agroforestry approaches or regenerative agriculture approaches? And then more importantly, how do we measure outcomes? And then to your point, have credible claims that we can talk about this. And it is a continuous journey. And what you need is transparency, authenticity, and credibility, because what we thought or what we knew a year ago, 5 years ago is different. And you got to
Amazing.
be comfortable with that.
So to help me understand, maybe in that spirit, like what are some of the organizing or the principles or pillars that help you define a relationship, knowing that I assume given the complexity of the supply chains, the standards, there's this fine balance of make sure we're directionally correct
Yeah.
in the way we're moving, right? Knowing that this is an evolving industry, supply chains are changing all the time, new climate issues are popping up, new governments, land tenure issues, all the things that are happening on the ground, let alone the complexities as you get further up the supply chain into the corporate institutional space. Can you outline when you're working with one of your brands, for example, and they're saying they want to execute with a community down below who they know is working on a particular commodity? What are some of the principles that help organize the conversation and the strategy approach to engaging with local communities to ensure community uplift, equity, fairness, ecological uplift, and things like that? Do you have an organizing or a framework that helps you take messy spaces, organize them somewhat cleanly, and then design more operational or executable strategies that then will move back up into the supply chain in the form of good products, good reporting, and building trust between the consumer, the corporate, and the supplier on the ground?
Yeah, I wouldn't say there's one framework for all of that. That's essentially a vision or a mission, so to speak, I think. But what you're hitting on is really critical in that. And I think this might be part of the reason that there's really no universal standard for regenerative agriculture or
Yeah,
measuring nature uplift, is that each ecosystem production system is so unique. And that
totally. I
local
love that.
context is what's critical, right? There's the socioeconomic, government, and environmental factors that are so unique, and trying to apply one framework to all of that is impossible. Sure, you can, but at some point you need to customize and adjust. And in the developing of those relationships in these local communities, establishing that local context and representation. We use local organizations to go talk to farmers and herders.
I love that.
It is not me, right? It is people who have grown up in those communities or who have been working with those communities, because you need to build that trust. You need to have this level of understanding with those production systems and those communities that, hey, this transition is going to benefit you. They need to buy in to this. And that's where I think regenerative agriculture is so exciting, is that with this transition, it really it doesn't need the corporate space in the sense of selling it to the consumer, right? Because you get improved yields, you get long-term productivity of the land, you get a lot of benefits for that local community. But where that corporate buy-in and support is needed is in those philanthropic funding and those grants to help enable that
Sure.
transition,
Yep.
right? And so you need to establish that local context. And then throughout our program design, we have our 6 principles that focus on climate, water, soil health, biodiversity, livelihoods, and animal welfare, right? And then we
Okay.
have various metrics and indicators connected to all of the industry aligned frameworks like textile exchange, like science-based targets, like OP2B and VWB, like the acronym salad that we know
Yeah,
in the fashion
totally.
industry. And so we are really an outcomes-based type of fund. And that's what we're trying to do, is to prove that these practices through causality can generate these positive incomes. And then we measure that in a variety of different ways. But then you throw in all of those macro factors like commodity pricing, demand, supply, that really can impact price premiums for certification. Certifications are great, but they're also terrible for some of these communities sometimes. So but a brand wants a certification. They want third-party validated to
Yeah.
say, yes, that fiber has this certification because it's assurance. It de-risks the situation for them, but sometimes certifications can be very burdensome and challenging to navigate for these producer communities. And so we're really just, it's a big jigsaw puzzle. It's a huge balancing act. And we're trying to understand what is working, what's not working. But ultimately, we want to get out of this place-based project approach of a single commodity in a production system to a landscape transformation, right? Let's go after the entire Eastern Cape of South Africa, where you need to manage, protect, restore, where you have beef and leather and wool coming out of these communal grasslands. Like, how do we get after the entire piece and create a strategy and a design around that? And that's the exciting work that we're doing now, is building those frameworks and that strategic approach so we can go into landscape transformation as opposed to biochar insetting for cotton fields, which is very important to understand. I'm not demeaning that in any way, but we need to be broader than that, and we need to scale quickly.
I love that. So I'm getting a sense that CI's approach, definitely your intervention is a systems intervention. And so I'm curious, like in your thesis of change and why CI is approaching this space, like beyond the, let's say for particular who help the companies who helped you start up this whole program.
Mm-hmm.
One, kudos to you. Thank you for making that investment. But two, like could you speak a little bit more about the theory of change? Like how do you take the learnings, the frameworks, the principles, the practical application of banging your head on a wall of trying to figure out how to take goal A from brand X and apply that to the Southern Cape or to Colombia or to whatever country in the world is producing something? What's the mechanism to take learnings, to take outcome results, to take the mistakes you've made and help shift how an industry shows up, right? Regardless of whether Conservation International is there or not. But how do you see yourself playing a catalyst role in the global, I'd say the global effort where everyone believes they want to support regenerative agriculture. They believe they want to have products that are friendlier to the environment and to themselves as human beings. Do you guys have like a thesis there that might be worth sharing so people can understand why CI plays an important role in not just the individual projects, but the larger shift?
Yeah, and thankfully, CI has experience in the food sector, having done these kind of landscape transformations, and now it's applying that to fiber and textile sector. So it's using that blueprint and it's going back to that landscape transformation. How do we change production systems so they're self sustaining? So there's a blended financial capital stack that enables wealth to be distributed appropriately across the value chain and also within these communities, that we're measuring nature uplift in a way that creates value for people, nature, and climate, as we like to say. But the reality is, and I think this thesis of change, and not to get too meta on you, but we
Yeah.
really need to look ourselves in the mirror, and we being the collective we society, right? And there are rules of the game. And I always say this: you can change the rules, which is possible and what happens and is very difficult, or you can play by the rules. And playing by the rules means, how do we balance business value and environmental value? And how do we rethink that game or rethink how you measure that? And
Yeah.
that's what I really think is critical. If we can connect the value of nature to financial value, whether it's through loans or whether it's through brand value or corporate value, whatever it may be, there's a huge opportunity to shift the narrative. And I want to say this, in no way is that trying to exploit nature and put a dollar figure on
Sure, I
every
get
bee
it.
tree, right? And I understand how that can maybe irk some people the wrong way. And I'm the same way in the sense that this shouldn't be another capitalistic type of way to value it.
Yes.
But there is that long-term opportunity, and we need to be able to measure the value of nature. And if we have an opportunity to do this the right way, and
Yeah.
very rarely do you get a moment in time where you can build things from the foundation the right way, right? It's always retrofitting or changing or adding or modifying. I think that's what is needed. And to your point, these three things of, all right, this theory of change, right? It needs to be a holistic approach. You need to take into account short term, long term, everything that is acting in that system, right? Understanding the nature or the value of nature and the ability to measure that. And then this last one I always like to say is, people just need to spend more time in green spaces and get out of the concrete jungle. And I always try to grapple with this.
Yes.
Why don't people care or know? And is it because there's just not enough green spaces or we're not out in nature? What is going on? How do we get people to care? And I think that is, once we can do that, that minor shift will be in a much better space. But that's a question I often ask myself is, how do we get people to care more about
Yeah.
what is actually happening?
Totally. I love it. And I wanted to at least flag this idea, and I think we're pretty deeply aligned here. We're in a capitalism driven economic model globally,
Yep.
regardless of the kind of hybrid versions of that any country has based on their political philosophies. If we can't put nature on the balance sheet, we're in deep we're
Mhm.
in deep. And I'm just appreciating both the practicality that I'm hearing in delivering high quality products that are in deep consideration and contextual application to local communities, all the way up these highly complex and difficult supply chains, all the way to like landing at somebody's these days in a box on somebody's front door and putting that thing on and it actually having meaning, that it's not just another frankly highly degenerative extractive product. While it may not be perfect, it is a massive leap forward in us having every transaction consider the impact to nature and the impact to local communities. And that's, I think, that is where I'm seeing some really exciting work that obviously CI has been in the business for a long time, and
Mhm.
it has I think, deep respect from all of us in the space who've looked over and at CI's work, and frankly navigating probably some difficult areas of being accused of this greenwashing or commoditizing nature and all the stuff that comes in with all of us, which I feel like we're in the same boat of, figuring out how to get nature valued very deeply in every transaction will get us light years ahead of figuring out how to calibrate our relationship to the natural ecosystem, which we are wholly dependent on. And I think that's where one of the last questions I was hoping maybe you could speak to for those who are listening. Again, my goal is to get this in front of as many sustainability professionals as
Mhm.
possible, is how to answer the question, or the maybe rhetorical reply is, we can't afford to make investments in our supply chain around regenerative agriculture. Can they afford not to, or what's the opposite of that? Can they afford not to, or unaffordable? And what is your kind of retort, or how do you address the business logic for these companies to make that investment that may, let's ostensibly, I assume, have some higher costs upfront in integrating practices and monitoring, reporting, and verification, and getting the sort of certifications and all the things? Is it worth it? What do you tell people who are asking you that when they are approaching their own sustainability journey when it comes to their supply chain?
Yeah, it's obviously different, as you can imagine, for every corporate fashion brand, if you will. And not to deflect your answer, but it's really trying to understand what are their motivations and priorities. Regen Ag is not rocket scientists, and the benefits across the board for the right application implementation of it create a lot of value. And so it's really trying to understand how you connect that value. Maybe it's a consumer driven motivation for that brand. Maybe it's policy related, right?
Yeah.
Maybe it's exposure of brand risk. That is what kind of drives that. But I think it's also around this concept of resiliency and building supply chain resiliency. At some point, climate change is going to catch up to the cotton supply chain, and drought and fires and floods and things like that are going to create cost increases for those corporate fashion brands. And so that's how do we get them to think long term is obviously the goal, which is a challenge just with humanity in general. But there's a lot of value in investing in landscapes and getting closer to the communities that produce your goods. Not to put Veja on a pedestal, but look what they're doing in terms of their regenerative ag and their transparency around their supply chain and the work they're doing from a circularity perspective. And it is phenomenal. And I think you can see how a brand like that can grow responsibly, have a responsible supply chain and a customer base that cares and is educated on their product and how they grow sustainably, not because they're trying to chase mid-single digits, high single digits returns, right? They're trying to do things the right way. It's trying to use those examples of how it works for certain brands as well to say, look, this can be beneficial to you in the long term.
Wonderful. Help us look forward a little bit. What do you see? Are there any exciting trend lines that you're seeing right now in the space? Are there, as we peek over into 2026, emergent standards, successful practices, new pilots launching, new funds? Help me give me like a very broad brush state of the state when it comes to regenerative agriculture and supply chains, whether it's want to narrow into fashion or more broadly. Are you on the upside and excited? Is there a little bit? Are we in the wallowing in the choppy waters, or is it not looking so good?
No, to take an optimistic tone, things are progressing in the right direction. I think it's just a matter of speed and how fast a person wants things to move. You look at like Textile Exchange, which is, I won't say governing, but it is a very reputable member-based organization in the fastest industry, maybe the largest in that sense. And they've done a lot of great work around various certifications. They're now pushing for this LCA Plus, which is trying to measure nature uplift so you can better compare.
LCA, life cycle analysis.
Yeah, that's right. Sorry, life cycle analysis.
That's so good.
So you can compare natural to synthetics and you can measure nature uplift in a way that is actually more representative of the impact that it can have positively. I see things like that. And then you look at some of these third-party service providers that are doing great work around soil mapping and carbon sequestration potential and soil health potential and the tools and the AI-enabled opportunities that are creating more visibility into some of these more remote production regions is exciting. And then there's no shortage of, I think, fascinating new technologies that are, again, simple in the sense of nature and understanding nature. We've got to remember, regen ag is rooted in indigenous principles, and it was how we managed the land prior to industrial agriculture. But it's like at this conference, there are 3 or 4 different companies that were using bees to measure biodiversity, right? Bees go out and populate or pollinate these fields, and then they come back to the hive. And they've been putting this little tape strip, for lack of a better term, that collects some of the pollen when the bees go in there. And then you can analyze the pollen and understand flora diversity in your landscape. So there's a lot of smart minds that are working to do things, whether it be app enabled to get farmer engagement or measure nature. But those are the things that I think are really exciting when it comes to where the movement is going.
Wonderful. Hey, but in closing, I think we touched on a little bit of the hope there, which is great. I always want to end people on a positive note. Anyone you want to shout out? I want to make sure, because I think it's important that you mentioned a couple brands that are making investments in this space, which again, I just want to make sure that they get their flowers. Or anyone else, just your colleagues or adjacent organizations that are really contributing to the space that we should all be paying attention to and just giving the appropriate pat on the back.
Yeah, of course. I keep a list of brands that I admire that are doing things the right way. I won't go into that list. There's a lot of great ones out there. I do want to just shout out, obviously, my team. I manage and direct this fund, but there's a team of talented and purpose-driven people that really bring this work together. Obviously, our partners, Kieran and Inditex, who are making this happen. I think we partner with 8 different organizations, different NGOs around the world that do a lot of the implementation in the field. And they're the ones talking to these producers, getting those signed agreements. Obviously, they're critical to not only our collective success, but moving the industry forward. Absolutely want to shout out them. And then I think I might have mentioned Rebecca Burgess earlier, but the Fiber Shed family and her ability to distill carbon sinks on Earth and how we need to rebalance that and how regenerative agriculture is really, I don't want to say the quickest and easiest, but it offers the most return and is in some ways changing land management. It's not, this concept of, okay, all these other low carbon technologies of sucking carbon out of the atmosphere, or this is just changing how we manage the land. And she was really the one who inspired me and really distilled it in a way that my simple brain could understand and get really passionate and excited about. So if she can get me on that train. I'm sure that messaging can get many other people on board and see the tremendous opportunity that is regenerative agriculture, and how we can really rally around our food and fiber systems in a way that really creates a lot of benefit for everybody. Healthier food, more durable products, lower impact products, all of those things. Yeah. And shout out to you. Thanks for having me. Really appreciate you
Of
reaching
course.
out.
I get so excited. I just get lit up by these. I get to learn, I get to meet cool people, and ideally it inspires some of our fellow sustainability professionals just to keep pushing. I know it feels like we're often pushing a big boulder uphill at times in our space, particularly given the current tumults politically and just globally with climate change.
Yeah.
But our work, your work, and all you all watching right now, y'all are foundation. So keep pushing. Jim, thank you so much for your time today. Really grateful for to know you're out there, and please give my regards to the CI team for carving out space for investing in this particular space of fashion, food, and regenerative agriculture. I'm sorry, fashion, fiber, and regenerative
Yeah.
agriculture. Very grateful for that. With that said, thank you everyone for joining the latest episode of Green Proofing Series. We'll be back next week with another show, and ideally get to meet somebody, some new person who's doing some amazing things out in the world. Jim, thanks again for being here. Appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
All right. Be well, everyone.